Welcome to Learning in the Making. I'm your host, Iran, and here on Learning in the Making, we invite you to join us in project-based lessons every episode. Every episode, we ask you to look around and create from the very items you find in your space. Today, we're doing something a little different. Instead of creating something, we're taking something apart. I invite you to reflect on the question, why take something apart? Here, we're used to putting things together, figuring out how to create the things that we envision. Why would we take time to take something apart, to deconstruct, to dissect? Think about that for a minute. You can write your ideas down on a piece of paper nearby, or even draw them out. Document your ideas. Why do you think today we're taking something apart? So, when I was a young teacher, and yes, believe it or not, I was once younger than this. When I was a young teacher and I was teaching sixth grade humanities in East Oakland, I got the opportunity to participate in this fellowship called Agency by Design. And in this fellowship, we learned a lot about what folks call a sensitivity to design, a sensitivity to design, meaning how and why are things made the way that they are? And when we talk about things, we think about tangible items, like things we can feel, like this marker. Why is this marker, made the way that it is made? But we also think about systems, things that are invisible to us, like democracy or capitalism. And we consider and we have a sensitivity to how are these things made and by who and for who. And today we are going to look at a thinking routine that comes out of Harvard's Project Zero, which Agency by Design is through. They have a thinking routine called Parts, Purposes, and Complexities. So today we are going to take something apart. We're going to look at the parts, we're going to look at the purposes of those parts, and then we're going to consider the complexities or the questions of our object in question. So, for today's lesson, you're going to need an object to take apart. So find something that, one, it'll be okay if it can't get put back together. And two, that's not too complex, that doesn't have too many parts or so many parts, but has maybe 2 to 5 different parts. So for example, I have this hand vacuum here with a lot of cat hair in it. This thing has way too many parts, I feel, for an introductory lesson. So what else could I use? I have this marker. It has a few parts. It has a few pieces, but it might not have enough for me to really do some deep thinking about. So I am gonna go with this bottle, this spray bottle that has rose water in it, which I love and spray myself with often, especially in the summertime to keep myself cool and my skin moist. I am gonna take apart this spray bottle. So why don't you go ahead and find your object? What are you gonna take apart? Go ahead and press pause if you need to, and return with your object with a big piece of paper and a couple writing utensils, a pen, a pencil, and some markers as well. Okay, see you when you get back. So now that we have our materials, the first thing we want to do is observe our object. So on your paper, go ahead and write 2 to 3 different things that you observe about your object. So the first thing, one of my first observations is that my object holds liquid. My second is that it has a top. And my third observation, undeniably, is that my object is pink, very pink. Okay, now, once you have your observations about your object, we're going to move into parts, purposes, and complexities. So the first part in parts, purposes, complexities is part, or parts. So we are going to start taking apart. I'm going to be very careful because there's still a little bit of liquid in mine. We're going to start taking apart our object. This thinking routine is all about slowing down, maybe moving at a pace that is not our usual pace, really being gentle with our object. If possible, we do want to be able to put it back together. And once you start taking your object apart and separating the pieces, you can do one of two things. You can draw the parts. So for example, I'm going to draw this top. And then we're going to label it. The other thing you can do is just tape or glue your parts or your pieces right onto the paper. So that's up to you. So now, as you move through, I invite you to either draw all the pieces of your object, all the parts of your object, or tape them down to your paper and label them. Even if you don't know the name of something, try to give it a name. For example, mine has this little opening here where what you spray comes out of it. I don't know what to call that. So I'm going to just draw it. And then I'm just going to give it a name that I make up. So I'm going to call this the spray opening. Okay? So don't let not knowing the name of something stop you from labeling it. Give it a name. This came off. Now keep observing your object, keep drawing it. Some things might even need to be drawn from multiple angles. So as you can see, I drew this here showing the side view, but there's so much more inside. I don't know if you can see that. There's so much more inside. So now I'm going to draw it from this angle. Okay, and there you have it. I have all my pieces drawn out. Or maybe you glued or taped yours and then labeled them. So after you have all your pieces labeled, we're going to move on to part 2, which is purposes. So now that we have all our parts mapped out and visualized, now we want to think about, what do each of these parts do? What is the purpose of each part? So now, one by one, for each of your parts, yes, for each of your parts, give a little summary of what you think or what you know that part does, the purpose of that part. And if it helps things stay a little bit more organized, use a new color. So I'm going to put my pen to the side, and I'm going to grab this green marker. And I'm going to go around to each of my parts and start summarizing the purpose. So for example, the top. What does the top do? It keeps the liquid inside. It also makes sure the spray doesn't spray on accident. Wow. So the purpose of the top, to keep the liquids inside, to make sure that spray cap doesn't spray down on accident. The top has a purpose. Cool. Let's look at the other purposes of all these other parts. Now you do yours. Go through each of your parts and describe the purpose. Okay, I just finished writing down the descriptions of the purposes for each of my parts. So as you can see, I have the screw cap as a part, and its purpose is to keep the top on and connected to the bottle. I have the water tube as a part. Its purpose is to bring the water up and through the bottle to the spray cap. The spray opening is to let the spray out. The bottle is to hold all the liquids inside. The sticker label tells people what they're buying, because that's pretty important. So once you have given all your parts descriptions of their purposes, we can move into the final thinking routine piece, which is complexities or questions. What questions do we have about the way our object works? What questions do you have about the way your object works? I'll invite you to grab a new color just to keep things organized, right? We're making our thoughts visible here. And let's see, what questions do we have about our objects? For example, I know a question I have. If the spray opening gets clogged, how do you unclog it? I'm going to write that down. I think that's a great question. Another question I have is, how do we know if what they put on the sticker label is true? Another question I have is about sustainability. This bottle is plastic, and I'm trying to use less plastic. Maybe a big question I have is there a better way to get rose water than out of these plastic bottles? Okay, so clearly I have a lot of questions. What questions do you have about your object? Grab a new color and write them down. Write as many as you want, okay? Doesn't have to be as many as me. It can be more and more and more. What questions do you have about your object? I believe that so much of our ability and power to construct the world we want to live in is to be able to deconstruct the current world that we live in. I believe that in order to make the world that we envision, we have to be able to look around the one that we currently live in and figure out what's going on and why. So as we close out, the big challenge is, can you put your object back together? It's okay if you can't. Remember, the purpose of today was to take something apart. And so if it stays taken apart, then it stays taken apart. I am going to attempt to put my object back together. And there you have it. That was refreshing. Okay, all right, we did it. We took something apart. We looked at the parts, we looked at the purposes, and then we looked at the complexities. We explored the questions that we have about our objects, as well as what are all the little pieces that make up our object, and what do each of those parts do anyway. So now you have this tool all the time. You can ask about the parts, purposes, and complexities about everything. Remember, things that are touchable or tangible objects in the world, but also things that are invisible. Like, have you ever thought about the streets and the air that the airplanes follow? Let's look at the parts, purposes, and complexities of that. Okay, that's all for me here today at Learning in the Making. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.